Hello, everyone. Good evening. It is a huge pleasure for me to welcome Charles Jencks, who I admire greatly as both as a colleague and as a friend to the GSD. Charles is a true polymath. Introducing him is not an easy task because he has made so many different contributions to architecture during his career. So let me start on a more personal note. Charles is one of the most generous colleagues I know. Generous because he cares to enter into debate with people that he disagrees with as well as he agrees with. We all know it's easy when we hear an opinion that we don't agree with not to contribute to the conversation. In academia, we hear a lot of presentations, and I think not often enough debates. Charles has always struck me as someone who is willing, when he has a strong opinion about a subject, to share it because he knows it's okay not to agree with everyone. I share with him a number of subjects that are dear to me, the use of history, ornament, form, style, the discipline, but we also disagree on them too. Our conversations can be combative, but collegial, so unlike the current presidential debates. I treasure my debates with him. They are informative, expand my own perspective as an architect, and I think they're good for the architectural culture because they treat subjects of personal investigations not as private territory, but as subjects that belong to everyone, and they should be interrogated, debated, disagreed upon. They're also incredibly fun. Charles is a distinguished theorist and a prolific author who has written highly influential books on the history and criticism of architecture after modernism, in which he has been a protagonist of change in the direction of architecture by continually attempting to reach a synthesis of seemingly opposing architectural practices and defining a trend amongst them. The most famous example of this, perhaps, can be found in his seminal book, The Language of Postmodernism, in which he defined and promoted the idea of postmodernism, and as an umbrella condition, embracing works as differently as Venturi Scott Brown, Rossi, Sterling, Hollein, as an antidote to the universalizing tendencies of modernism. This is because central to Charles's ongoing commitment is the refusal to reduce architecture to a single mode of expression, and his belief, and I'm quoting him now, it is the historian's obligation to search for the plurality of creative movements. His book of essays titled Meaning in Architecture, his tantalizing diagrams, such as the one supporting his book Architecture 2000, The Evolutionary Tree, in that language of postmodernism, his later books, Architecture of the Jumping Universe and Critical Modernism, all embrace architecture in this pluralistic way as a way to argue for a multiplicity of meanings in architecture at any one point in time. His preoccupation with contemporary architecture's ability to relate to people in a meaningful way is one I share. What does the huge diversity of coexisting styles mean? How do people perceive that meaning? What is it politically capable of? These are some of the questions that him and I have debated just over a year ago at the Design Museum in London. Whereas I think the agency of style is to ground the aesthetic experience of buildings in the micropolitics of everyday life, Charles thinks style is relevant as a visual code to convey metaphors that address the issues of our time. In other words, I think of style as a way of making intentional choices about how buildings are arranged to move their experience away from the present drive to similarity and recognition, to open up the possibility for new types of action. And I would say Charles thinks of it as a tool to help people to understand the world as we know it. Charles's provocation at a time in global culture when some architects, including myself, are skeptical about a building's ability to convey meanings, is that architecture is legible and that the task of the architect is to design buildings that people can read just as they do with language or literature. This reminds me of Richard Rogers' lecture 2 nights ago when describing his proposal for the extension to the National Gallery. He said that the building was designed to be read by people. But of course, by that, he meant reading the parts of the building relative to the uses internal to the building. Charles speaks of people reading associations external to a piece of architecture, which reminds me of Panofsky's iconology, except that Panofsky's iconology was a method of analysis for the art historian, not the ordinary users who perhaps, I would say, lack the shared image memories that Charles proposes as an ultimate source of shared meaning today. But Charles and I agree a lot more on the question of meaning than he may admit. I cannot think of a more powerful evidence of this than the remarkable Maggie Centers, a new type of building that Charles and his late wife Maggie invented in 1995 to act as a home away from home for cancer sufferers all over the UK. Now, ever since, Charles has commissioned Maggie Centers to great architects to design, and this is where I think that him and I agree entirely that architecture carries significance not through familiar associations, but by being different and inspirational. After all, if he didn't think so, he would not ask Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, and Richard Rogers to design the Maggies, but the local architects who would be far more versed on familiar and shared motifs. Charles has also designed great landscapes and gardens across the UK. They belong to a lineage of landscape design culture that stretches between the history of British Isles, Bronze Age earthworks through to English garden history. They are sensual, bold, and even for those without a knowledge of and understanding of physics, truly beautiful. He has also created the Charles Jencks Prize for Architecture, a platform for architects simultaneously devoted to theory and practice of architecture. I feel honored to have been one of those who received it in 2005. His passion and enthusiasm for the relevance of architecture in the world we live in today is obviously infectious because his daughter and son have become landscape architects. I hope you agree that no one else before has made so many different contributions to architecture as Charles Jencks, and are as excited as me of having him here tonight to speak to us about his current architectural preoccupations. Please welcome Charles Jencks.
Thank you very much, Farshid. We don't really disagree, but it's fun to try. That was very kind of you, and thank you. And thank you, Mohsin, and all of you at Harvard. I spent 8 happy years here. That's more than usually students spend at Harvard. Anyway, and I have many friends who've come tonight who I haven't seen for a long time, and my family who are here too. So it's a particular happy moment to be back. Especially my great friends who taught me everything I know about physics, Gerald Holton and Nina, his wife. And anything I might say tonight about physics that I get wrong is not his fault, I don't think, but mine. He taught at Harvard physics, and his famous book, Holton and Roller, that's how they describe the book, Holton and Roller, not the name, the history of physics and how physics works. Anyway, thank you all for inviting me. So I'm going to speak on the architecture of the multiverse, which is a controversial concept in physics. And it's a strange one to talk about. And it's, of course, a metaphor, like the architecture of the universe would be, or the architecture of nature was in 1900, or the art of nature. As if nature, the cosmos, and the multiverse had intentionality and was an architect. Of course, this is a very old idea. Plato said that God was the great architect of all things, an idea that has recommended itself to architects for the last 3,000 years, or 2,000. And Bucky Fuller called architects of the universe a universal practice. So the equation has been around of what I'm going to say, and I have a particular take on it in my work, and I'll also be going rather like a sketch I'm going to give you tonight, not in deep theory for Michael Hayes. I won't be giving you the hard the hard problem. I'll be giving you the easy overview, because it's a sketch. In an hour, you can't dig too deep. But I'll say a few words by way of introduction about this jumping around. First of all, my work, as Farshida said, comes from the problem of meaning in architecture. And I would argue it's not only associations, which she's been mentioning, but the performative, the haptic, the feeling, all of that. And we live in a curious time today of the iconic building, when we have iconic buildings without any understanding of iconology, or, as Panofsky also said, iconography, that is the conventional signs. What should a building look like? In what style should we build? What image should it convey? How should the public relate to it? These are all the kind of meanings I'm going to be dealing with tonight in the age of the iconic building, or the age also of the billion-dollar building, which creates a real crisis in architecture, because with $1 billion, it's becoming, my argument is that it's becoming the new norm. The new normal is $1 billion, because you can't make a billion-dollar building disappear. Not even in New York City can Donald Trump hide $1 billion buildings. If you're going to spend $1 billion on a building, you must take responsibility for its meaning on all these levels, on all the different levels. And there's a real crisis when society, the client, and the architect, three of the most important people in negotiating what those meanings are more or less confused as to public meaning. And it's contested, politically, socially, economically, so forth. So I think what I'm going to say responds to that crisis in ways different maybe than architects normally engage, but I think they did engage with the subject matter of architecture in the past in ways that I'll be speaking about. So that by way of introduction to my quick sketch. My old teacher here, Siegfried Gideon, had in one of his books on architecture and the eternal present, and Egyptian architecture particularly, showed this amazing drawing of the beginnings of stone architecture of Zoser in about 2800 BC. And it shows the pharaoh or the king sitting as an astronaut, sitting back, tilted at 20 degrees, looking through a hole in his serdab at the northern star, the unmoved mover, because that was the only thing in the universe that everything rotated around. So, and this was a code of architecture, conventional code, an iconic code, and it told you how to build the next 400 or 500 years of pyramids, all of which have these little astronaut holes designed to see the unmoved mover. And their iconography was greater than that, of course, but it's interesting that there he sits, at this mission control, like an astronaut about to be launched into outer space. So the idea then of nature and the universe, the cosmos, has been around. Oops, excuse me. And Vitruvius, and later Vitruvian books, which illustrate him, always go into the analogy between the body and the underlying proportions. And in the first book, he discusses how the human evolved, first in small groups, and then with fire, and then with language, and then with architecture, and so forth. And he shows the natural conditions of architecture growing that way. And the ninth book of Vitruvius is devoted to timepieces, astronomy, astrophysics, and zodiacs. The second book, I just illustrate, or these are Renaissance illustrations from the second book, where he tells you how to get the job. The most important theory in architecture is how to get the job. The first most important, which he tells you about, and the second most important is how to keep the job after you've got it. Anyway, you may remember this little way he was supposed to be a very boring writer, and so to spruce up his 10 books, he has these little introductions where he tells the story of Dinocrates, who Roman architect who needed the job, and who exercised hard and made a good body and oiled his body, became almost nude, put on a leopard skin, and walked down to meet not the pharaoh, the king, the emperor, Alexander, and sat next to him. And of course, in the stadium, where a man with an oiled body and a leopard skin looks rather unusual. And so the emperor says, hello. And he says, hello, I'm the architect, and I want to design a building for you. In fact, I want to design a whole city for you. I want to design a city in your shape. Alexandria. And Alexander said, what a good idea. But how would you plumb it? How would you how would you get the water to flow in the right way? Well, I can do that too. The water flows down. Well, how can you get the fields to work, the corn to grow? Well, I can do that too. And you see, it's all here. And of course, so then Alexander said, well, it is a great idea. I think I'll just ask one of my advisors. And they said, hey, forget it. It doesn't work. But the point of the story, so then he says, I'm an ugly man. So I don't get jobs. But the story of Dinocrates is that the emperor never forgot him. And so when Alexandria, came to be designed, guess who designed it? He was, got on the telephone. And that's the moral. So in the age, pre-bling, this is the age before the billion-dollar building. I'm telling you this story partly to tell you that the architectural profession has faced it again and again and again. How do you deal with big money, the 1%, the problem of symbolism, getting the job, keeping it, and all the rest of it? It's an old problem. Read Vitruvius. Now, another cosmic precedent for what I'm saying is, of course, Ledoux. In his show, La Show, he illustrates, again, analogy is so important in architectural meaning for architects to communicate with themselves through art and through metaphor and through story and through narrative. All of those things inspire the architect as well as their audience. And of course, that's very true of Ledoux. And so with this 5 or 6 drawings, which Vidler's show are analogies, this one, if it's the cemetery of show, has that little phrase, architecture, the architect is up among the clouds, which roil in tumultuous turbulences, vying with each other. That's where architecture exists. That's architecture, okay? The planets, and what does he show? The Earth, and of course planets around it, and Saturn up there, if you just look off, and then the sun below. It's a very dramatic drawing, and his words are very dramatic, and that's why the famous book From Ledoux to Corbusier is an unbroken series of thoughts on this theme. And, excuse me, trained at Harvard, of course, I became completely immersed in Le Corbusier in every way, and particularly his cosmic writings, of which follow him for 50 or 60 years. And this early postmodern building of his, Ronchamp, which is multiply coded, the first iconic building of Ronchamp, along with the Sydney Opera House, which you can decode both explicitly and implicitly in all sorts of ways. Here are 5 implicit metaphors which map one to one in certain ways, some of which are appropriate to the job, praying hands, or the nun's cowl. You can see the shell. I mean, the drawing is rather literalist. A ship, there's a lot of ship in all of Le Corbusier, and Venturi's duck before the fact. And what the monks who took me around would say, the metaphor that they saw in it, so this is if you like, an esoteric code, but once they had told me about it, I understood it was a mother, a happy mother, smiling here, embracing her son and daughter. In other words, the anthropomorphic form. So Corb, of course, is a painter and a sculptor, multiply coded his buildings, and a lot of these meanings he talked about, a lot he wouldn't talk about. Now, the cosmos as an artist, the universe as an artist, before the multiverse as an artist, is, again, an old idea of prehistory, of Plato, of others. And these shots of Hubble, this is 2015 version of a 1995, the most famous Hubble photograph, which revealed the origin of a lot of stars in 1995 and became a photographic record with corrected color, of course, of what's really happening very close to us. Oops, sorry. Oops, better go back here. It's called the Eagle Nebula. This view of it doesn't show it as an eagle metaphor, but you can see that. It's called also, in another metaphor, maybe more known, it's called the Pillars of Creation. Pillars, an architectural metaphor, columns of uprising dust and gas exploding up. And it's interesting, the 15-year difference in photographs or more, 1993 to 2015, things have moved on and these stars have emerged and blown away the gas and dust. This is a lot of gas and dust, and more stars are emerging. So it is creation of stars, 10,000 stars, right in front of us, right on our doorstep. And it is a form of art. It's photographic art, and it's very moving. So the universe is an artist in many ways. You could say, well, is the universe conscious? Well, that's debatable. But if you look at these great satellite images, they are art, and they have great interest for me, particularly to translate the universe into a universal language. The units of the universe is what I pursue in the age of the iconic building. What's going to last for the next eternity? That is, the next 13.82 billion years. Because we know, suns die after maybe 10 billion years, but they're pretty eternal. Atoms may live for 40 billion years. So if you're going to design an icon and spend $1 billion, then you need to know what it should be about. Well, so eternity is a good idea, maybe. You don't have to accept that. But, what's so interesting about looking at the universe as a creative artist is how dynamic the sun is as satellite images. All the time, it's like that drawing of Ledoux, roiling and the tourbillon, these tumultuous magnetic storms, electromagnetic storms, and send out very positive things like heat and light, that is photons and photosynthesis. So that it's, I'll come into this later in iconology, but basically for us, the sun has been worshipped since the Egyptians, and Apollo, the sun god of reason, the god of war, the Roman god, always a man, Sol Invictus, the victory sun. The sun is a man, victory, and the Christians, Constantine always fought with the sun to his back, so it blinded his enemies. And of course, he changed the solar symbolism to Christ in the great battle. And so the symbol of the sun became Christ for another 1,000 years, till Louis XIV took it over and branded everything in his empire with a stamp of the sun god himself. And a phrase. So like Ford Motor Company or any big multinational, he had a logo and a motto. And it hammered in the meaning, so you could see it all over everything he did. So he was the first great brander of the near contemporary age. Anyway, you have to criticize the symbols that come down to you. And so my work is a critical work. And there's certain aspects of this very benign sun which are vicious and killers. In other words, these flares, these solar moments when the electromagnetic storm comes out and closes down the Canadian area from Montreal to Toronto to Quebec in 1988, I think it was, but it did in 1830. So this is killer storms, and they may have killed the life on Mars because Mars' electromagnetic things shifted. So all of this is very dramatic, very much alive, very present, and very much of our time, the great golden age of cosmology. Now, my work is inspired, as landforms and landscape, was inspired by this part of Scotland, near where I live sometime. And it's inspired me with, of course, its haptic, its bodily presence. You drive through it in the afternoon, late afternoon sun, summer, and a metaphor pops out at you, which the Chinese had, which my late wife Maggie first told me about. Is the idea that a good garden is a metaphor of rocks and water, or as they said, the bones of the earth and the arteries, the water, you can probably not see it here, bones and water, rocks and water, and skin, which is pulled tight in the summer sun. So all of those are bodily images which are natural to us. You don't have to understand Chinese gardens to appreciate them. And they show nature as the artist. Again, this metaphor, which is 19th century one, which comes out of photographers who go to the Grand Canyon and say, I am going to photograph nature without any editorial comment. I'm just going to show nature because I am alive. I'm a piece of nature. I am the eye of nature. I am nature taking a picture of itself. So the idea of the universe as an artist and the nature as an artist is an old metaphor. And if you don't believe it, look at the bowerbird, because the bowerbird is not a human being, and it constructs a building. There's the male bowerbird, and it constructs it out of wattle and daub and a lot of other material it finds on the side. Some of it blue bottle tops, and others blue flowers, and then different kinds of berries. And all of that is to create a garden and a house and garden, in order to get a mate, to get the bird, according to the bad pun. So it's architecture, isn't it? And it's by nature, right? I mean, you can't say that. And it's a kind of cultural form, isn't it, too? So it shows what a lot of ethologists are showing today, the continuity between us and the rest of the natural world. So our tradition in the West takes this metaphor of Plato, God, the great architect of all things, a man, laying out the universe, earth, air, water, and fire. By the way, here's water is a fractal there, but most of the classical architecture, this is a Gothic god of the 13th century, of a moralized Bible. It's a Bible page. He's stepping out of the Bible to show his omniscience. He makes the laws as well as the forms, and he makes it as an architect. He's not a builder, and he makes it beautifully, and he makes it with geometry, and he makes it according to a narrative. So that's one of the codes, deep codes of architecture and our culture. And opposed to that, or not maybe opposed, but parallel to that, in a parallel universe, is the 2003, but the 1992 maps of the universe as first seen. This is 2003. I operated on it. Those crosses and knots and so on are my operation. There's the Milky Way, and there's the eye of the universe. But the point is, I'm showing it here, is that our golden age of cosmology gives us a different iconography and a different set of understandings than we inherit. And it's changing, and it's dynamic, and it is a kind of golden age. So architecture has to respond to that and speculate on it, and I do that with artists and scientists and friends and philosophers and people on the street and so forth. In other words, it's multiply coded, all my work, and some of it is asked for to be explicitly an icon, and this was one of the ones I was asked to design by Matthew Ridley, a scientist himself. It's written on the gene. And he has a place near a highly traveled road. And he said, I want you to design an icon that can be seen from the road, which is a gateway to the north of England. And so I thought, what is worthy of being an icon? what do we respond to the most? And of course, as the painter Brock said, the most important thing for one human being, is obvious point, is the face of another person. So the face is the most important thing. We have more neurons in us to recognize other people's faces, and naturally we respond to people's faces because we are human. So it became a face and then a body, and then a woman of the North, then a lady of the North, and then she was called lots of other things, which were not too pleasant. But she is very big, and she's a mediation of a coal field back here where they were digging the coal. She was called Restoration First because they restored the site to keep the local inhabitants from being overwhelmed by the dust and pollution and so forth of the digging of an open cast mine. 30 or 40 big vehicles go there and dig out the coal. Anyway, iconographically, she is, of course, a woman. I had designed a man. She was cupping here, but he was lost in the... part of what I'm trying to say tonight is the problem of fighting for meaning. You often, the client, society, and other architects may not agree with you, and you have to fight a lot of the way. Anyway, so she's 2/5 of a mile from toe to head, and there's 2 miles of paths. And for most of the area, you come into the forest here, you see her here, there's a series. My problem was to get everybody to walk the mile or 2 miles to end in her head, in her forehead. So I adopted a symbolic program, so it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And each area is codified and refers to things in the far distant landscape, views that you see. So she's outward looking until you reach the 10th point at the top, which is the goal, which is about 100 or 120 feet up in the air. So it's a high point and the goal point of this walk through 10 stages. So it's an explicit symbolic program, but it's full of allusion rather than only explicit signs. And it's interesting that a photographer spent a lot of time there without asking me or me telling him anything. And he spent a whole night when it was very cold photographing it here reflected in the water, the profile of the woman and her body rotating around the North Point, that point that Zoser and his architect Imhotep wanted to symbolize, the unmoved northern star. So there's stage 1, which is a series of different faces, eyes, nose, mouth, and interlocking faces, and you can see people running around it. And it ends in point 10, that's the culmination point, and points at the universe and the eye of the universe, and even says eye of the universe, in case you're wondering what that eye is and what this is. And it says 10, so you follow the bouncing ball, so you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 10, and it points up, straight up. It's a hand made out of resin and concrete. Well, a young man, I guess it was a young man, didn't like my iconography, and he took a sledgehammer to it and broke it in many pieces, but he left, and I think it, I'm hypothesizing here because he never declared himself, but I reckon he was 18 to 22, the angry young man, and he smashed it, but he left it right by the hand. So I picked it up and I paid for it and I had it redone. My client didn't really like this. He said, "I don't want sculpture, don't do that." I said, "Well, look, I don't want to be censored. This is the meaning, the 10th is pointing to the universe and actually to the sun. You see the sun there, and there's the little Earth there, and it says 93 million miles away. It tells you how to get to the sun. Anyway, so, censorship by terrorism or by breakage, by vandalism. And so he, 3 months later, we repaired it, it was broken. I repaired it the 3rd time, it was broken. I repaired it a 4th time, it was broken. I repaired it a 5th time, and so I called Matt Ridley. I said, "Look, Matt, will you pay for half of this repair? I want to do it in steel and, and bronze, so he can't break it," or what? And Matt said, "No, I don't like sculpture." Anyway, so I paid for it, and it's still there. So go and see it. It's, you know, and the point I'm telling you is not only the conflict in codes and in meaning, but also what's called in landscape the law of decreasing vandalism. And they found, I mean, there is this law that if you plant some trees for, let's say, people who, young men, don't like the trees and don't like the idea, you know, just, anyway, vandalize it. If you keep, and they vandalize it, and you replant it, they vandalize it, the third time you plant it, they stop vandalizing it because they say, oh, well, people must care about us, you know, they want us, you know, and they sort of give up. Well, that's the theory of decreasing vandalism, anyway. So, symbolism. Now, billion-dollar buildings. You know, I think my feeling is that they start in about 1992 with the Getty Museum, and a lot of the age of the iconic building does start there, too. And I don't know if you know the story of this. Richard Meyer, a very good architect, but a white architect, and the Whites, one of the Whites, was asked, would design this building on various principles of abstraction, like this 405 coming down here and the shifted axis. So it's full of esoteric shifted axes. You wouldn't know that unless I told you, but believe me, they are shifting. And of course, it's in a code of an Italian hill town, and like Peter Eisenman's building in Santiago, another billion-dollar building, it is formally very interesting. But Meyer won the competition against Jim Sterling and others, and with the idea that he wouldn't do another white washing machine. That's the very metaphor of the client who I happened to be talking with. And Richard said, yes, I won't do a white washing machine. I won't do a white building, I promise. So what did he produce? $1 billion worth of off-white. Anyway, he doesn't see it as white. But the Getty Museum does. Anyway, it's in a code, you know. It is one architect's language at $1 billion scale. And this is what I mean. You can't hide the fact of the lack of meaning here. It won't go away. And this is a $10 billion development in Las Vegas, designed by Norman Foster, Caesar Pelling, and Danny Libeskind, the Crystal shopping center. And, you know, I can't remember if Norman backed out finally. I know there was trouble and, you know, angry recrimination, so I'm not sure he built much, and I don't know how much Caesar built. But you can see what's happened to Daniel's crystal metaphor by Gucci. And the $10 billion, you know, bigness is a problem which Rem has not fully addressed. Anyway, too much. And it's gone broke twice. I mean, it's a problem socially, it's a problem architecturally, economically, socially. And our new embassy, the American embassy in London, is another $1 billion building, which has a kind of nice alibi of being sustainable, at least on the facade. And, you know, it's an understated moat around it to keep, you know, anybody from getting close to it, obviously, for reasons we all know. Anyway, for $1 billion, again, it's really sad that the meaning of this glass dumb box is there for, you know, symbolizing American, I don't know what. Now, the iconic building, you know, has produced great work and interesting work. This is one of the great skyscrapers you all know very well by Norman Foster, so I won't speak on it, just to show that it is the iconic building, which has all sorts of feelings and overtones and performances. It runs on vegetable oil, so it's a very green building. And it's called the Gherkin, but you will admit that it has a very non-mappable relation to a pickle. It really doesn't look like a gherkin if you put a gherkin on the screen. And they call it a gherkin, the taxi drivers. Everybody in Britain, from Oscar Wilde on, calls it a gherkin in order not to say what it looks like to them. Because in polite company, you're not supposed to say those things. But if you analyze it as a multiple metaphor, and these are Madelorf-Riesendorp's story. When I was writing the iconic building, The Power of Paranoia. Paranoia, remember that the Eiffel Tower was hated for 20 years before it was accepted, and then another 5 years before it was liked, and then another 5 years because it was loved by the modernists, and then 5 years. It became the symbol of Paris and then of France and modernism and the whole work. So from hatred to total love is the power of paranoia. And if you're an iconic architect, you should ask yourself, is my building hated enough to be loved later? It's a hard one, but this is a paranoid building after 9/11. It is necessarily military, a screw, and a bomb. After 9/11. So I did this collage, and the publisher said, no thanks. We don't want to sell it under military hardware. Try again, Charles. Anyway, there you see 3 more, and 3 more again. Madelorf-Riesendorp added her interpretations of a brain, I think rather interesting, and a Rotring doll. My interpretation of the Fibonacci series in nature was what I was arguing about as a cosmic skyscraper. But what we ended up with something of the Cape Canaveral launch pad. And you can see I changed paranoia to enigma because my argument was that in the age of the iconic building, it is the enigma which has become the conventional sign of the icon. As conventional as, the monument had crosses and steeples. The enigma, since De Chirico said in 1913, when he was asked what he painted, he said, I paint the enigma. And it's a long argument, but I think the enigma has arrived in architecture as the multiple coding of metaphors and one-liners into multiple liners. And that's a very positive thing, especially if most of them are related to nature or the cosmos. So you see Ronchamp and some of those, and Bilbao, of course, ushering in the iconic age, or our age, and then crystals of Rem and Coupe Himmelblau, and the Scottish Parliament, and then Foster, and then the Bird's Nest. Well, Bird's Nest was a self-conscious, explicit, argued for metaphor that Herzog and de Meuron worked out with Ai Weiwei, and it won the competition for that building. A great building for the 2008 Chinese Olympics, or Beijing Olympics, I should say. So, sometimes architects are straightforward and will publicly talk about their public meaning. And I show you just 2 different takes on this because I'm not arguing that the cosmic meanings are the most all-important, because I think social meanings are as important. And in our I call these little icons, the little iconic buildings, at least half of them are little icons, especially Frank Gehry's, which you see here, with this kind of lighthouse tower, this squat tower, and looking out across the River Tay towards the distant mountains, just on the edge of the hospital, a big hospital here with a wonderful garden in the shape of a maze, the metaphor of the journey of cancer being like a maze you're trying to figure out. And Frank doing an understated building here, kind of bungaloid building here with this funny wrapped roof. So immediately, and this was just after Bilbao, by the way, and it was, no one could figure out why Gehry was designing this buildings of, so small after Bilbao. Anyway, he was engaged by the program by Maggie, who was a great friend, and me, and I'm also a great friend of Frank. Anyway, it's the cancer program and the service that goes on here which inspires many architects to produce really top buildings, among them Richard Rogers and Ivan Harbour's building for us, where the icon is in many ways a mixture of a kind of internalizing, embracing, orange, pulsating, lively building as opposed to a white hospital. It's next to one. Mass big hospital, and with a very nice curvilinear garden in front, designed by a good garden designer. And it embraces you on a spiral path and recalls, let's say, the Chinese orange red as a form of life, of the qi, of energy. Does that very well. It's a little icon with a pavilion with a flying roof. It's incredibly uplifting and warm and inviting. So meaning is multiple. I'm not saying it all has to be cosmic, but I'm saying the cosmic meaning is what interests me. And working out an iconology is what I've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. And when CERN asked me to design the center, I tried to persuade them to build an area around their dome. And I worked on an iconology, which they really liked, but it was based on collisions. And oops, sorry, there's a picture of it. I keep getting this wrong. The collisions are like their eye or their telescope or their microscope. They take two protons, collide them, and then they read what the universe might have been back like at the beginning of time. And that's why taking this iconic picture of the man himself, of Einstein's theories, and putting Le Corbusier's glasses on him, and his eye here, was how I designed with my daughter Lily, who we worked together, the landforms and the whole program based on collisions and asking the question, how does the very small quantum relate to the very big universe as a whole? Well, that's the program, and that's the design from the quantum, the story of the universe to the present and the very big. And of course, we don't know. These are questions. We don't have the answer, but it is the big question. So the question marks that you can inhabit and work in. The cosmic rings. Now, working with scientists is really an interesting project, and I've done that over many years. Worked with Jim Watson on 5 or 6 different DNAs. One's here. Here's Jim. And I work against Richard Dawkins. So my idea, and this I don't have time to go into, is double design. It's a whole idea that you have to get yourself into the science as it's understood and get through it to create feelings and metaphors which are different than selfish gene. Of course, Richard Dawkins, very good writer and in a way very good man, has thrived. He is a good man, difficult, very difficult man, but he believes, well, maybe belief is too strong a word. Anyway, he thinks that the selfish gene is a good description of genetics. Well, it's as good as the altruistic gene. In other words, both selfish and altruistic and neutral are the way genes really work. But he became the scientist in charge of the public understanding of science for the British. All right? And he was given $1 million by Gates for his selfish genes, selfish theories. And of course, he denied that he was saying anything about selfishness. He denied that he was a Thatcherite. But actually, the young and, this metaphor became really odious. And it pervaded a feeling of a lot of novelists like Martin Amis, who, he said selfish gene, most important thing in his reading. Anyway, so my work is a critique, an attack. It is the landscape designer, no longer alive, Ian Hamilton Finlay, who described a garden not just as a retreat, but an attack. And he did some really interesting work with gardens in that manner. So my attack on the selfish gene is to show in this flying, as it flies through the cosmos, the 6 cells, the center of every cell is DNA. This is the difference between science teaching in the universities and the way I work, which is to try to look for metaphors and expressive elements. And you have to understand how it works to a degree in order to map, say, the way the DNA, ACTG, and all of that are pulled together by the hydrogen bond, how they come out. I won't bore you with all that stuff, but it's essential that you understand what the science is saying in order to go beyond it. And so in designing it, those 6 cells all have a DNA of a different type in their center, and use plants and walkways and so forth to tell the story. So it's a narrative right down to some of the details. The 6th sense, the 5 Aristotelian senses, taste, smell, are all there. And the 6th sense is called the female sense, the sense of anticipation, the sense of intuition, the sense that you can feel the future. And so here was a sculpture which shows a woman. She's bouncing on a spring, a car spring, and she has her fingers in the air here, picking up the vibrations, just as the plant, Love in a Mist, vibrates all the time. Because the garden is a sensorium where the 6 senses make you in touch with nature. So she's looking, her mind and her eyes are looking at her brain. And what happens is a receptor picks up a signal, goes into a part of the brain, and she reads it. And she says, is that illusion or is it real? So she's bouncing away. Anyway, Gerald Holden, who's in the audience tonight, told me once, because I don't speak any German, now I only speak one word. He said, Einstein said, a good scientist has to feel, what is the next thing? What is going on here before he knows or she knows what's going to happen? And he said the word was Fingerspitzengefühle. A finger, a sensation at the end of your fingertips of what it's going to be before you know what it's going to be. So anyway, that I was extremely happy that one word of German I know. I think I know. I think I pronounced it right, Gerald? Okay, thank you. Now, to go back to conflict, I've designed parks in different places, and one in Milan with a man who didn't speak much English, and I don't speak any Italian, so we didn't converse much, but it was for a Alfa Romeo plant, which had polluted the site, and Marco Brunelli called me in. And so I said, well, Marco, here's my design geometrically, the school here, and anyway, big area, hospital here. So pulling together the site and a small garden of scent and all that. But a symbolic program of, in this case, prehistory in Milan, history, of course, Leonardo and the great Renaissance, and the present, that is DNA, and so double helix, all those different ideas and meanings. Anyway, built it over many years. It's taken 15, 20 years. And more or less, most of it is, when I won the struggle, was built as I'd hoped. And this is the prehistory mound, and you're looking over the DNA area there. And I wanted the sun, as in prehistory, to bounce along the tops of these beautiful stones. This is nature's art. Bounce along as they do in June 21st as the sun rises in the east, which is over there, and sets in the west. It goes down there. So all these rocks get bigger, 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 bigger. And you sit here and you look at the explanation there in Italian or here. It tells you things about the galaxies and time and a thing, solar clock there. Anyway, that went in. And he said to me, Charles, I like your velocity. I like your Alfa Romeo. It's got a lot of velocity, but I hate your ornament. And I said, Marco, I don't do ornament. Thinking of Peter Eisman. I don't do ornament. I do symbolism. It's all symbolic. Oh. Anyway, nice man. We don't have to agree. So, but it is a problem when, Milan, like Madrid, like every major city, is surrounded by, a kind of battle of different kinds of identities. And while I wrote Ritmo del Tempo and Ritmo Sorge, Sorge means made it out of kitchen knives. I cut off the handles and the euro coin showing the sun bouncing along, so that you could understand the symbolism. What happened was the graffiti artists came along and graffitied everything, including my symbolism, which was okay. Actually, they kept away from the symbolism per se, and they graffitied around it. I thought it was terrific. You know, a mixture of their meanings and my meanings. Anyway, the problem was the client thought, oh no, we must take Mr. Jencks' symbolism away and keep it under lock and key so it isn't damaged. So they took away all my symbolism. And what's left is the graffiti. I mean, there's a problem. And it's a problem of meaning, you know. Anyway, there's a good example of positive meaning in another scheme, in another park in South Korea, in the southern tip of South Korea, in Suncheon City. Korea, South Korea, and North is mostly mountains, 70% mountains and 30% valleys or floodplains. And this one, in the furthest part, has a beautiful river, the Duncheon River here, and then a huge city surrounding a mountain that they've kept. So, you know, it's really interesting, the Korean people, because they still believe in shamanism, in spite of the fact that it was, you know, put on the index by a previous leader, dictator. And they believe in nature, and they take walks in nature. So they walk the mountains. So the mountains are all around them. And they, in 2013, they had an ecological festival, a garden festival, the first one, National Garden Festival called the Eco-Geo Festival, and they asked me to design the center of it. And then I asked and said, could Lily do it? And they said yes, and so Lily and I and others worked together on it. Anyway, they put us at the center of 80 gardens, and we put forward a narrative holding the line, hold that line, the eco line, because what's happening is that everywhere the city is sprawling, and the concrete and pollution are killing nature. And you can see factory farming here. Anyway, what we did was we turned their city inside out, and we turned their water inside out, and we produced our design, which was the river that gave the ecology here, the best wetlands in Korea, which are down here, why they said, well, let's reinvent the city based on ecology. We turned their river, which comes from their mountains around here, into this walkway here. So their river became our walkway, their city became our 8 lakes, and their mountains were miniaturized so that each one of the mountains you see from their Bunghwa mountain, you can see the real thing and you see the borrowed landscape here. So we put their mountain in the little miniature there. And of course, that's an old Asian idea of miniaturizing. And then we put an amphitheater there. And then there are 84 national gardens around there, and the French garden, and Dutch, so. So, as we interpreted their ecology, they had a lot of ecologists, but they didn't see it the way we began to see it. It's a 100-mile ecology. So the ecology goes all the way out there, and it goes all the way up the mountains. They were talking about the ecology of the wetlands only. Anyway, we gave them this program, and then we understood their program, and then they understood our program, and then they turned it around, turned it upside down, what we'd turned upside down, and then they performed it amazingly in an Olympic-style performance, focused on their wetlands, and here you see all their great species, including the hooded crane. So we really understood their symbolism, and they performed it with 5,000 people at the opening, Olympic-style opening, where they did amazingly strange things, like they had all of their national costumes here, women singing on blow-up rubber boats, while the white piano of Liberace was playing here, and a calf and a bull were taken up there to be sacrificed. So, you know, it was very hard to read directly the symbolism, but we could understand. Lily and I sat there completely gobsmacked, because they didn't tell us they were going to do an Olympic-style opening, and they used us as the stage. And so 100 hooded cranes came down, the black crane, which is a symbol of the city, and they danced on the water. Actually, it's 1 inch below. And they floated there to piped-in music and amazing things happening. So ecological regeneration of the economy. So ecology versus the economy or industry was there to our performance. And as things happened, of course, ecology and the cranes and all the goodness of their landscape was supported with the shaman, the boatman singing in poetry, 13th century. You can see that, by the way, the military of the 13th century wandering over our bridge. And he comes by and he sings. And this is all translated for the people who are listening, 10,000 people listening, and went out to national broadcasting. So and then suddenly there was an explosion, bombs went off, and these erections occurred on our main mountain. And I thought, here's symbolism. I interpreted them as some Asian gateway, with a rope. Actually, what they are pylons, industrial pylons, showing the triumph of industry and economy over ecology and the destruction of the ecology. So then I know, it's incredible. Then the hooded cranes, a hard rock band started playing here. Jet skis came in, and all the hooded cranes were murdered. And then, a factory, I'm not kidding, with Liberace playing here, a factory exploded. I'm giving you the short version, by the way. And then the hooded crane and her lover were separated, and they ran up our hill, and she was singing. She would sing and stop on our hill, and sing beautifully, and she looked so beautiful. And then the motorcycle gang came in, and they chased her up the whole hill, and then at the top, just as she was going to reach, and of course they're filming it. Look at them film there. As she reached the top, they hit her, right, knocked her down, and she's dying. So the ecology is dying. She's dead on the side of the hill. And, everybody's sighs and sorrow. And this is also unbelievably funny, then these young children come out, 10 to 12, all wearing Next T-shirts, the Next Act. And, Next Incorporated. And, how did it end? Well, all the 84 nations came in and sang the Ode to Joy of Beethoven and held hands while ecology was reborn. Okay, so you see, every now and then you win one. And they're funny, it is now 5 million people come to the first year. Sorry, I've gone wrong. And for the next. And it has regenerated the city. So it was a set of meanings which drew from their desires, and we drew things from it, and then they drew it back from us, and then it came together. So it's interesting. It's now the National Garden of Ecology in Korea. And a curious thing is that no one knows a bit about it outside of Korea. No one has ever asked to publish. No one, the BBC wasn't interested. No one's interested. It's really curious. Anyway, there we are. Recently, I was asked by Richard Buccleuch, who's a very old friend, to do another coal site, desolate coal site in Scotland, which really was polluted, which had been, smashed up, open coal mining, in which there was just rubble and desolation and desert. And when I went there, I thought, well, there's no money. The first problem is the client didn't have any money to spend, which is always a problem, but which the architect faces just as much. Well, actually, if you architects want to be happy, because life is tough and you aren't paid well, just think of landscape architects, because they're paid less well. And when they run out of money, the landscaper is the first to suffer. It's true. So you're not at the bottom of the food chain, but there are people below you. Anyway, so I had no money and this polluted site. What do I do? And so I thought, well, I don't know. But as I began to look, the wind, first of all, the wind whipped in. I realized suddenly, hey, a desert in the wettest part of Britain. It's amazing to have a desert. You know, it's reverse gardening. So one idea, and you know, then led to another idea. Let's see if I missed an idea. Yeah. Anyway, I did, you know, the minimal thing I'd do a north-south line, scalloped some of the edges. The coal had been dropped there, designed to galaxies stripping each other, an amphitheater, solar amphitheater, and other things, but very quickly in this model. And yes, and then, that's what I was looking for, this slide, found out, doing research on the area, that Auchentaggart Farm in the 1870s, a laborer dug up this gold lunula, it's called lunula, for the moon, a cosmic shape, made out of gold, beautiful gold, tooled gold, gold with ornament you can just make out here. So, and it clip here. This is better than Mycenaean gold in a way. It's like those Irish, the Irish gold, showing the relation between Ireland and Scotland. Anyway, Auchentaggart means field of the priests, and this was about a quarter of a mile away from the site, this incredible cosmic necklace, which is about 2,300 BC. So for 4,300 years, coal and this crossroads of Scotland were existing on the river. And so the cosmic nature of the site, you know, became what I designed. We looked at the site, and since there was no money, what we had were some boulders. We found 300 boulders, and I classified them into 500, then 1,000 boulders. And finally I said to Richard, look, Richard, we have boulder fatigue here. We've got to do something with these boulders. We can't just bury them. And he said, okay, what can we do? And I said, well, let's build the first multiverse in the universe. And he said, what's a multiverse? Well, so I told him what, you know, scientists are thinking what the multiverse is. And we built it, this ironic multiverse, because, of course, how can you put the multiverse in the universe? Here you see it flying through the, you can put a universe in a multiverse, but you can't put the multiverse in the universe. Anyway, so that's what you see. It's flying through here. You see the north-south line. You see the galaxies stripping each other. You see the supercluster. You see the North Point, and signs and symbols and explanations, both explicit and implicit, throughout. And we've done that. We've built it over 3 or 4 years, from 2011 to 14, opened in 2015. There you see it under construction from the air. There's a painting I've done of it looking down on the solar amphitheater, the sun amphitheater here, where 5,000 can collect for open-air ceremonies of the towns and the locals. And painted with the sun shining on the south axis into the solar amphitheater. And what it is an illusion which you actually can see, like a rainbow, it's very rare. The sun would be here, and when the ice clouds form, it shows this complete circular form. Anyway, so painting, drawing, computing, modeling, and interpreting what is the meaning of our relation to the sun. You know, after Apollo, god of the sun gods, after all of the things I've told you about, I found out, of course, I didn't know this, but I knew a bit of it, but those are those incredible storms that occur, these electromagnetic storms. And here comes a flare, a killer flare. And what does it do? It's aimed at the Earth in this rendition, and it hits our electromagnetic shield, which is here, which protects us and turns the storm, the flare, in both directions away from the Earth. So allowing the sun and the photons and the gravity to embrace us, and deflecting the killer storm into the Aurora Borealis, or the southern one, you know, the great dance of lights, the northern lights, which you can see in Scotland. So an art of rhythm led me to paint this painting of the sun as a woman, a quizzical one with electromagnetic storms as eyes, nose, mouth, and a flare coming out, being deflected into, into the beauty of that dance as we follow her through her spiral motions around the galaxy every 200 million years. So, a critique of the male sun god coming from the Russians' victory over the sun, if you know that great Malevich drama of 1913. This is in that critique mode and using a different interpretation of the sun than he did, than Malevich did. And we managed to build it last summer, and here it is in view. You can see the primitive stones. I mean, this is Art of Povera. And two little signs here for those who want to read about where the rocks come from and what it means are let into the stones. So those who want to follow some of the symbolism, it's explicit and written. And it communicates with the town, the teachers of the schools, the students, and the poor, because this is a very poor area of Scotland. And we have performances on a high art level too, with great performance artists who, dance and play around here in the desert. So we've managed to preserve the desert in the wettest part of Scotland. And here you can see Andromeda being stripped by the Milky Way. They're the two galaxies which will interact in 4 billion years. We know that, or we think we know it. At least that's the odds-on bet, that they'll become a super elliptical. And you can see in the center of Andromeda, first of all, these beautiful stones, the art of nature, and then a black hole. And renditions of that in different graphic form or physical form, or both. Leading from the two galaxies, Andromeda and the Milky Way. People know what the Milky Way is. A lot of them know Andromeda is going to hit, and they come to the supercluster of galaxies on their walk to the north. And in this painting, this night painting, you can see that walk after always getting bigger from these two galaxies to a supercluster with dark matter and all of that. A zigzag path up to the multiverse itself, the culmination. The theory of the multiverse is that 30 or so parameters, here's not Patrick Schumacher's parametric, but real parametric. The runaway expansion, the kinetic force of the universe, produces universes that fly apart, or gravity that is too strong, collapse, whereas our universe is fine-tuned with not only gravity and the kinetic force, but these 30 parameters, the constants and so forth. Extraordinary, sort of amazing. We are living in the golden age of cosmology. We must use these ideas coming from scientists, from astrophysicists and cosmologists as a background for our art. So there's a view down with the badly parametricized universes where they fly apart or the gravity too strong, and then just right universes, Goldilocks universes, leading to our universe there. And again, a seat to sit on that explains that, and in graphic terms, and then the stones carved in the most primitive way with words telling you this one's ripped apart because the kinetic force is too strong or gravity is too strong. Here it says gravity 2, number 2, strong. So, 100 boulders, 100 universes in this multiverse. And at the top, the seat has a description of those that fall apart because they're kinetic force is too strong or gravity is too strong, and well-balanced universes lead to our universe. And that is sculpted on the tall, very interesting boulder, which is nature's art. So Naturally, we can't prove the multiverse exists. It's a hypothesis, it's a speculation, one that maybe many people hold today. But like all theories, something skeptical in all of us arises in our, at least in many of our minds all the time. And so we burn the multiverse every year in our celebrations on June 21st. We have a solar performances with the towns and with good performance artists, and we burn or explode it. You see it exploding there in the drawing above the carbon, which of course comes out of the coal. So I say this because the imagination is always going beyond what we know, and it is our space in cultural time which would question the multiverse as well as any idea that we know the whole universe. So that the imagination has to burn from time to time what we love. A phrase actually coming out of Le Corbusier. And I end with this shot here of a strange 1870 painting, drawing, or graphic really, that's colored, which is quizzical, published in Flammarion. We don't actually know quite what it means. It's slightly hippie, but of 1880 time. German, it has German overtones in this nice village here with, you know, Monsieur's son up here, and nice, it's a nice pastoral landscape. And this man, evidently he's a man, walking along, and he stumbles, he trips, he falls with his walking stick, and he falls through a worldview. Look, he falls through the old worldview into a new worldview, which he says hello to, I guess. We don't know what he's doing, actually. It could be his heartbeat going on here. But I think I interpret it, the symbolism that I interpret is that it more or less is a very good analogy of where we are in cultural space-time. If we know where we've been, and we know somewhere where we're going, but we are breaking through into a different worldview. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I'm going to start with a couple of questions and then open it to the audience. Well, I love the landscapes, the gardens. I think they're quite different to when you look at when you critique or celebrate you know, the architectural works. It seems to me that when you work on your own landscape projects, you use the metaphors or more as a kind of food for thought, and through working with them, you actually, you know, you describe them constantly in the images, but I would say they actually get processed into something new. You insist that people should still see it in reference to what you started. I kind of see them somewhere else, which I think makes them actually really interesting. When you look at architecture, I think you look at them as if they are sculpture. I think architecture is artificial nature, with its own rules, with its own mechanisms, with its own possibilities. And, you know, the creativity of the architect is how it plays or even constructs that artificial nature. You choose to completely suppress all that creativity, and you stand outside and kind of talk about how it is received, which, you know, and even in that kind of reception, you treat people as an audience, whereas architecture is produced for them in many, many different ways. So why reduce architecture to sculpture? Yes.
I wouldn't want to reduce it to anything. I don't think it is just sculpture, of course not. I also, like you, appreciate materiality, the space, the rules, and the going beyond the rules. So I've never said it's the only thing. One of, this is where I think our differences are more apparent than real, if I may say, Farshid. I do think architecture is about performative use. And that's why, for me, deep icons relate to the use. And they tell us something about the use. So they're comment on the use. And I wouldn't want to underrate that. I mean, by the way, as a Harvard-trained architect, I have to tell you, functionalism was the reigning doctrine, partly coming from Le Corbusier, who said, we look at the functions first. I'm not sure that's ever true, but you also have to look at performance, function, and materiality, and all, the 10 books of architecture. And you could say that I'm concentrating on book number 3. I don't know, one part of architecture, its communicative part. And I agree that it isn't necessary to be understood always. It's to be perceived unconsciously. I mean, after all, Walter Benjamin said, architecture is the only art which you can correctly perceive without knowing it. I mean, you can't go to the theater, you're supposed to listen to the actors, you're supposed to listen to music, but you can, it's perceived unconsciously. Now, that's true. So a lot of people, fetishize that truth, I would say, and reduce it to performance or whatever. And what I'm really arguing for, if you're hearing what I'm saying, is that architecture is a public art. And it's one of the freedoms of architectural art is to mean something. And in an age of agnosticism, in an age of neutrality, in an age of reductive functionalism, in an age of the selfish gene, or a whole lot of other odious metaphors like Big Bang or wimps and machos or military metaphors that scientists, whip off and claim that the universe started in a Big Bang. I say, you mean like your mother was a firecracker? I say. I think you have to criticize reigning metaphors. So my work is critical explicitly because I think architecture is a public art. Has been in the past. And in the past, we had agreement between the people, the client at least, and the architect. Although, of course, there's always been dissensus. We know that. And I admire your work particularly because you do push beyond the known and beyond the familiar, and you defamiliarize your work. I mean, that's one of your goals. My critique, if I may turn it around now and criticize your work, you are too interested in affect. And affect is only one of the many meanings, and it's the one of, it's the empathetic, which your work is very good at. Right? But it's, I would say what you need is more symbolism. But you would say, I need more affect. Well, let's have dinner.
No, Charles. Charles, I would say I leave the meaning construction to the people who experience those affects, and you are adamant that you feed them with the meanings. And I think it's an impossible task.
I don't feed anyone any meaning. They have to, no, we agree, because look, why do I spend so much time participating with the local communities, going out and speaking to the schools and,
I know we agree, but it's very important in the context of, I think, a lot of students here, that it's fun to disagree. I think why you said you focus on book number 4, you said? 3. Why separate? Why separate? Even if let's just say, you are interested in communication. Let's just say, well, of course, buildings perform by people turning them into thoughts and meanings and feelings. Why separate it from actually the kind of the art of construction, and I mean that in a broad sense? How does architecture become critical if you separate them? How does the architect question how to make decisions in terms of assembling buildings if you don't connect the kind of the production of architecture to the reception of architecture? You just look at the reception. And I just think that leaves the architect in a very difficult position. You take the side of the client and the branding, and I think they're bad examples. Why not get good examples? The bird nest is not the best example of the Herzog de Moran project. They are a fantastic office, and yes, you're right, maybe in a kind of a competition, they chose to talk about it as the bird nest, and maybe it is actually quite evocative of the idea of a nest, but is that what makes it a great stadium?
I mean, it's obviously more, you know, you want an ironic answer?
Go ahead.
Okay, bird's nest soup is the most expensive soup you can buy. It's about $100 a bird's nest. Anyway, that's one of the reasons. And when Ai Weiwei took a pot and he dropped it, you know, he was making a comment of the pot as a receptacle. So if you look at the building, it's multiply coded. And that's always been what I've been saying about the problem with the iconic building is it's a one-liner. And an icon must work on many levels, and these are coded. So the short answer is look at semiotics, the theory of signs, and see that everything, clothing, why am I in a sub-Harvard jacket? Think that's an accident?
I didn't notice that. But
Yeah, you didn't notice that? Okay. The point is that everything, including the things that we don't like to think about, is symbolic. The things we betray. So, if you study as Umberto Eco, who was an old friend of mine, and I really thought put semiotics on another level, shows it's the problem with what he's telling us is that words. Why am I speaking to you now? Why am I using a verbal words? Why don't I give you a building instead? And you just give me another building and we just exchange buildings without talking. Why do we talk with our mouths? Well, we do because, as semiotics show, is that speech and language is imperialistic. It's cannibalistic. It eats up all of the different semiotic systems. And so as soon as you have, as the semioticians say, as soon as you have an umbrella, you have a sign of rain. And as soon as you have a society, you have shared signs. And these signs are stereotypes, and they are how I'm communicating to you through words. So the words are like the visual metaphors I'm diagramming there. They're meant to suggest that these codes are shared public codes. And the architect, in the age when there isn't the shared meaning, and this is where, there is a problem, and this is where you have to know that meaning is always negotiated in the end. Let's take a Christian meaning. When the great heyday of the Christian West is supposed to be Chartres Cathedral, a great building where the architects gave up the money that was supposed to go to the architecture, and they gave it to the sculptors. So the sculptors could design the greatest sculpture in the West of that time. And they also gave up some of the money to the stained glass. And so some of this greatest stained glass, and they gave it up, and all the trades were working together. So it's Chartres has always been considered the home of the Western Christian ideal. And what's his name? Adams, who wrote the great book, Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, the man from here, wrote the whole history of civilization as the dynamo versus Chartres. Anyway, be that as it may, the Chartres thing, if you look deeper, as a Marxist might look, say, actually, when the Bishop of Chartres, although 60% of the economy of the Ile-de-France went into building Chartres, and Chartres was a great collective expression of their beliefs and the architecture and the sculpture and the meaning of the universe, actually, 20% of the population was bloody angry that their money was being spent on the wrong thing. Okay? Now, that shows that even our symbols of integration, of collective well-being, have the dissonance. And so we are living in a dissonant era now. There's no question. And my struggles, and I've only shown you two, where they break my hand or they graffiti, or, that's minor. But all the things that the clients refuse to do or society hates, you have to negotiate everything. You have to fight for it. If you're an architect, Le Corbusier was right. You've got to fight for what you believe in, even if it's stupid, as Corbusier's urbanism was. Okay, but he was a great architect, and he was very poetic, and he faced this negotiation. So I can only say, maybe the semiotic thing is overstressed when I write a book on the iconic building, and overstressed in the rest of my work. But I think if my defense is that we live in a great crisis of meaning. I'm not the first person to say this, by the way. As you know, it's been said for over 200 years. When the collective symbols and meanings of our society are in conflict. So, that's the short answer.
Okay, I have so many questions. We'll discuss them later. So I think I should open it to the audience. So questions, please, from the audience, anyone?
Thank you, Mr. Jencks. My name's Harry Allen, and I'm a Hutchins Fellow here at Harvard this year. And you started by talking about the billion-dollar building. Now, I'm also, outside of Hutchins, also working on a multiverse project myself, which was what drew me, as well as your reputation, to seeing this presentation tonight. As I said, you started by talking about the billion-dollar building. And what's interesting about the idea of the universe as architecture is that on the multiverse side, a billion is really far too reduced to talk about anything of its formation. Everything is far outside of the scale of any kind of numeracy almost that we possess. And on the side of fine-tuning, which is how the universe works on its most microscopic levels, a billion or a billionth is really far too large to talk about the scale of relationships between the constants that exist. So I guess my question is about numeracy. How do you address the multiverse and the issue of numeracy when these numbers are far, far outside of human experience? And how do you just ignore that quality of numeracy, or do you suggest it in some other way?
Well, as I've been intimating, when you don't have any money to spend investigating how you would express it, it's very hard. And in this multiverse, the only thing I've really been allowed to express in a more detailed way is that relationship between the sun as a positive, embracing, if you like, woman or not, with its gravity, with its heat and its photons, and its magnetic storms and its solar wind. So there is a more translated metaphor worked out. With the multiverse itself, for instance, if I didn't stop and show you the supercluster of galaxies, but in there, the avenues of the rivers of gravity, dark matter, the scaffolding assumed to be behind gravity, or before, with gravity, but before matter. I've constructed very primitive metaphors which are expressive using what I had to hand, which are these rocks, three different kinds of rocks. Red rocks, red sandstone, which can be quite beautiful. I showed you one or two. White and yellow sandstone, and then this 80% of the rocks are mudstone. And, when I've been saying, I don't speak buildings to you, I have to say that, that corny phrase a lover makes to either way is say it with flowers. Well, I have to say it with boulders. And saying it with boulders is bloody hard because they're huge and they're inert and unsculpted and there, Archipovora. So I can't address in a more direct way your question, but I do think it is a good question, because how do we relate to the billions of bignesses and billions of smallnesses? I think, you know, the poetry, the famous phrase of William Blake, to see the world in a grain of sand and eternity in you know, everything is analogy. Martin Rees, who's a friend of mine, came to the garden, one of the Garden of Cosmic Speculation, and said, you know, Charles, I really like what you do because it's all metaphorical. And actually, us scientists, we can't even tell you how a hydrogen atom works, all right? And what you're doing is showing relationships. So, and I was really pleased he said that, because it's true. I think meaning is relationship. And we have so much trouble relating to billions and billions and billions. And Carl Sagan's problem, you know, there's billions and billions and billions. Anyway, I think the artist and the problem is to scale, and Corbusier was onto this, you know, to scale, because you can scale up into relationships, and scientists can do it in their mind very fast and have no problem with it. And if they can do it, you know, artists can learn how to use relationships, I think. I haven't been able to do it, but it's a good question. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Hi. I'm this side. Here. Yeah. I'm Sahaj. I'm in the Art Design and Public Domain department here at Harvard. And before I start, let me say that I see a strong similarity of your works and Roger Anger's works in Auroville, Pondicherry, in which the whole master plan is actually based on the concept of the cosmos, at the center being where the sun sort of meets the water and stuff like that. And I also had the good privilege of having a glimpse of your work when I was working in New Delhi in a firm. So my question is, architects somehow I feel have this constant urge to impose, in a way, their idiosyncratic sort of beliefs to build an artifact in the built environment. Whether you mentioned, maybe say Richard May's constant need to build a white building, no matter what, or even the fact that your constant need to rebuild that figurine of the thing pointing at the sky. It has to be a certain way. My question is, before we go to the universe, how do we make architecture? What tools do you personally use to make architecture more community-centric approach? What are the ground studies which one does before getting on to a symbolic approach? And also, when you've done a lot of projects all throughout, and when you go to these different places, do you also delve into the mythology and cosmology of the place you're building, or do you follow a universal approach?
Well, you can probably guess my answer is that as a postmodernist, modernism was universalist, postmodernism was local and universalist. So I listen and try to get in the local, as well as follow what scientists are telling us about things. And, you know, is the universe itself local? That's a good question. Does it have, you know, the classical answer is no. The laws of the universe work everywhere in the universe, and that's universal. And I think what the interesting truth, though, is that all science has a kind of history to it, and emerges in history and emerges through a culture. So it's embedded, even science, even the universal, is embedded in a particular way in a culture. And I am not trying, as a modernist, to say that this kind of symbolism is enough. For sure, it isn't. I think this is where I don't really have an argument with Farshid, even though it appears we do. I think, you know, it's layered. Meaning is really layered. And a true symbol is related to the local use and the very intimate present. But it's layered all the way up to the cosmos. And that's what I think architecture is, that art, which brings that layering out. And of course, it always brings it out, so the architectural historian can date it within 10 years. You know, it's interesting that even, well, of course, there are buildings that are very hard, which are replicas, say some neo-modern buildings looking like the international style, built in an international style, are very hard to date, except, actually, if you look at the way they deteriorated or not, and the plumbing or something, it's very hard to fake the time, even with a universalizing style or the universal. So, you know, my predisposition is to go to the local and to interview people. If you think the client, of course, is a very privileged part of the job, but so are the people who are going to use it, and so are the people who live there, and so are the children who are going to come from the people who live there. So who owns the meaning of architecture? It's clear that that is over time and is a plural audience, and pluralism is where we live today in the global village, and its great philosophers, Isaiah Berlin, and I think that's about enough for me to say.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Charles, for the lecture and for joining us here. I have one question in regards to the very astute observation that you made in the era of the billion-dollar building. There's somewhat of an interesting corollary in terms of the current age of the so-called Anthropocene and age of urbanism today, which is in relationship to the quantitative and the cosmological analogies that you make and direct relationships. There's also one on the other hand, not unrelated, of the chemical age of the 1 part per billion, which is particularly important in terms of an age in which we now see, sense, emissions, effluents, concentrations, whether or not it's to resource extractions, all the way to industrial pollution that we now recognize in a different way. I don't have a question so much as just sort of soliciting a sort of reflection on maybe another side of the billion-dollar building and potentially the 1 part per billion, how that could potentially influence thinking about environments, urbanization.
Well, it's a very big question, but I just was in New York at the Botanic Gardens. I was driving, we're taken around by the head, and showing me the rocks and the celebration of the American landscape in part of the New York Botanic Gardens, if you've been there or you know it. And because I love rocks, and he was taking me to rocks and showing me rocks. And he said, you know, all these rocks are, of course, original rocks, maybe unlike some of the rocks that were put by Olmsted in Central Park. But actually, they're not original either, as someone was talking about, about the artificial nature, because pollution has changed them. They're all black, because even, not in the center of Manhattan, but they've been changed constantly by recent civilization, the last 200 or 300 years. And so the head was his name, wonderful name for the man who runs this original forest. His name is Forrest. And I said to Mr. Forrest, so what is your philosophy of how to preserve this American virgin forest? If you think, he's just told me that you can't. So then what do you do? He said, in the past we thought we could get it back, and we got rid of all the invasive species. And so we kind of try to get rid of invasive species, knowing that whatever we do is going to mark it, and is marking it, and is actually artificial. It's partly artificial. And in a way, it's like an architect asking themselves, in what style should we build? In what meaning should we put in? What functions should we articulate? What should we suppress? There are all these choices, and I think what I'm trying to do is to say, this is a freedom that we have. Meaning is a freedom. We're in a crisis of meaning. We have to struggle for the meanings we care about, and build what we think are the most important meanings in our time. When a time of collapse of religions a end of negative nationalisms too, and positive nationalism. The end, you know, the postmodern theory was that the end of meta-narratives. And when meta-narratives end, architects are in trouble because they have no common meanings that Farshid can talk to her client or society about directly and say, I'm going to build you this meaning. I'm bringing this meaning to the table. This is what I'm an expert in doing. Because society is confused, agnostic, or neutral and driven by multiple clients. Now we don't have a client anymore. We have 5 banks in a $1 billion building. We have 3 accountants, firms, and 15 board members who are arguing. What kind of a client is that? The client's walked off the job and doesn't know what the job is anyway. So my feeling is you write a book called How to Fire the Client. And the idea is that the client has, in a way, walked off the job. I could ask Richard to what he feels about the client. And the client is very hard to pin down, Richard, isn't he or she? I mean, because there's a multiple client, and it's an economic client. And the client doesn't have their confidence to be what a client needs to be. I think in architecture today, the client has walked off the job. So you should fire the client. The first thing you do when you get a job, say, you've got to be a good client. I don't know.
I would assume that there is Your response would assume there is a common symbolism. I would disagree.
No, I'm saying
yes,
there isn't.
That's why you're saying that, if I understand rightly, if you don't give the symbolic right to the building, the client will walk off the site, let us put it. My point is, I don't think symbolism, and I agree with you, is in itself, has a great meaning without all the rest.
No.
By the way, just
Yeah.
let me just one more.
Yeah.
So one thing is I don't believe that the symbolic, when I look at the things that you've got, you interpret the symbolism, which in many ways, you can call it universal, but it's very personal, in my opinion. But going on with that, there is also the question of, I don't think this has been any different ever since the first hut. This has been a discussion which continues. We are always in a crisis. As I keep on saying, Wren got so fed up when he built up some walls, he built a wall the way around. It hasn't changed. We're always at war to create buildings of certain ways. But it's not the symbolic that's the critical problem. It's the combination of the process of construction, the cost, and all these. I don't think the client is the problem. I think that probably there are ways through, and I'm worried about leaving symbolism as being the leading inspiration, because it's changing all the time.
Well, I wouldn't say it is the leading inspiration. I'd say it's, first of all, we agree that there's a crisis that it is made. I mean, Wren is a classic example, right? Okay, so the crisis has been around. But in some periods, it's been easier for the relation between the architect and client. And, clients are not, in the era of the rent slab building in London, most of the buildings have absentee clients. That's what I wanted you to say. Well, they do. I mean, that's why London is so rotten. And that's why most cities are so rotten, because the client isn't pulling their part of the deal.
No, capitalism has failed.
It's not just capitalism, it's also socialism failed in the same way. Anyway. They both failed.
I didn't say that.
Okay. Anyway.
I didn't say that. I said capitalism is failing. You added a rather important part.
No, I mean, well, capitalism is failing, but that, of course, but all economics as the end of life is a failure, which is common to both socialism and capitalism, 2 isms invented and coined in 1820, 2 old railroad trains.
I just want to pick up on something that Charles just said as a way to really wrap it up. And I completely agree with Charles that the space of making decisions between how do you put all this stuff together to make a piece of architecture is really the space of freedom of the architect. And you could call this, how do you give meaning to this? Now, meaning can be significance or it can be signification. I would say you are interpreted as you are championing the idea of what kind of meaning in the sense of signification the architect is going to introduce to this kind of exercise of putting the building together. Maybe another way is to say, well, what significance does this have in a certain context? I think there was a question. And I think maybe we should just keep this as a kind of a question. And I think what is really important, and I am encouraged by, I think we've moved away from just a kind of a simple excitement of the digital. And I think everyone, practitioners, students, are all really trying to tackle this issue of, now that we have these exciting tools, and now that we know more, and now that we can measure the universe, and we have a lot more data, how do we make decisions with it, and how do we make a difference? I hope you've all enjoyed the lecture as much as I have. Please thank Charles Jencks.